last year we were planning to do this, next snowdown. So let's be thankful for good weather. And once again, have social impact at the press club. Give a hand, give a hand. Actually, they were here last week too. And for the Brown School had their phenomenal social policy scholars here. I'd like to first thank our sponsors for their support and so that we can do these events. Gary, you want to come up?
Yeah, okay, sure.
Gary Parker, who's the director of the Clark Fox Policies. If your students are with you, they can come up, please. Okay, and Mary Jo Monahan, who's the CEO of the Association for Social Work Boards. Of course, everyone knows Dollar Coffee. Social education, I don't see Angelo McLean yet, but he should be here at some point. And my dean from Columbia, Eric Garfield, who is recovering from hip surgery, so he will not be here. But thank you all for your support. As I was thinking about this event, I recall back in the day, in I think it was around 2011, when I was on the Hill as a Deputy Chief of Staff for Congressman Ed Towns. I was invited to a SWORD, Society for Social Work and Research, doctoral luncheon, and he asked me if I would come and speak on whether or not social work research in psychology. You might remember that event, and I looked at him and said, this is going to be a short speech. Because actually there wasn't a whole lot going on in terms of social work research, but where things are about to change. And you will hear today of the work that Mike is doing and the possibility of having a bill introduced in Congress for child development accounts. We're actually working on a bill now with Barbara Lee's office, Congresswoman Barbara Lee's office. Our legislative director, Emma Arabi, has looking at the draft that Dr. Sharabi has put together, and she thinks that it's looking good. So we're looking forward to that. And Emma, by the way, our legislative director, is a social worker. So I'm excited about that, having a social worker in those kind of positions, because we want to see more social workers on the Hill, where our values and our knowledge and skills are definitely needed. And besides, lawyers aren't restricted to the court, so why should we do that? So I'm going to give way to my special friend, and we met quite a while ago on the Hill, and we have worked together for a long time. And Mary's, Dr. McKay has done an incredible, made incredible contributions to policy on all levels. As the inaugural director of the Silver policy, what is it, for poverty policy and research, and now as the dean of the Brown School, overseeing the Clark Fox Policy Institute. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Dr. and Dean Mary M. McKay.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay. I love that this room is filled with social work champions. So thank you all for coming. So my job, and Charles, wherever you landed in this room, thank you for that nice introduction. Thank you for not saying that we've been probably working together a decade or more, and that we're old in this collaboration. So I appreciate those comments. So I am Mary McKay, and actually, technically, I'm Mary McKernan McKay, and you'll see in your program that there's two of us with the same name, and I've always wanted to meet her. So I'm excited to hear your comments as well. I have the real privilege of being the dean of the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, an historically incredibly strong school of social work, and a school that I so admired across my professional career that in addition to having the privilege of coming and working there as a dean, I have two daughters who both have their MSWs and asked me where they went to school. I did send them to the Brown School, and that's how much I believe in kind of the social work education that we provide. And you're going to hear from my colleague Michael Schrodden in a few minutes, amazing faculty member, who has devoted his life to improving the circumstances of children and families in poverty. This is not only an area of scholarship, but an area of personal mission. And I'm pretty sure, Charles, he is not going to rest or do anything that begins with the R word like retire until a bill gets passed and public policy is changed on behalf of kids and families. So I'll give Michael an introduction in just a few minutes that'll say a little bit more about your professional accomplishments. But my job is to kind of start this panel off and ground us in social work, and ground us in the history of the social work profession and its link to policy. And why I'm going to make I don't want to be disagreeable, Charles, but I'm going to make a real strong pitch that along the journey, social workers have been really played a driving role in public policy. But I think I'm going to really strongly agree with you that we also need a larger platform and a more public face to actually influence the current day policies. And so those are some of the points that I just want to cover. So first of all, why was I so excited to be the dean of a school like ours? But I know that Rick Garth is in the room, and University of Maryland is amazing as well as many of you that represent other educational institutions in our profession. So why is social work so important? It's because we are educating the next generation of leaders. And we're doing that in a specific way that has its roots in the history of our profession, which is we are educating those social work students now and our alums as they go out and practice. We are educating them to directly improve the lives of individuals and families and groups. But we also recognize that it's not what's wrong with those individuals or families or groups, it's also what's happened to them. Their contexts, their environments, the doors that are opened or closed really has set up the life circumstances for the kids and families that Michael and others on this panel have so much cared about across the decade. And I think that's what those person and environment frameworks go back all the way to the 19th and earliest 20th century. When you think about the kind of major leaders in social work, there was a movement called casework that set the foundation for my own practice career in children's mental health, in child welfare, and working directly with victims of domestic violence. But I also have a PhD in social work from a place called the University of Illinois at Chicago. It was called the Jane Addams College of Social Work. And so Hull House was on our campus. And so the second stream of social work that is so embedded in our history, but also in that person and environment framework, has to do with the settlement movement, has to do with the incredible recognition that without addressing poverty, without improving living and working conditions, people's lives were not going to improve. And so it is bringing those traditions together of really concentrating on the support that individuals and families need, but being very clear that without improvement in their circumstances, the way we treat each other, the supports available, the opportunities available, that those circumstances are not likely to improve. And in fact, we're likely to make a really serious error, which is
there's something wrong in our environments, not necessarily something wrong with the people trapped in a set of circumstances. And Michael's going to talk some about that. So you can see that I feel pretty strongly about our profession. It's probably, not surprising that I have a bachelor's degree in social work, a master's degree in social work, and a PhD in social work, and I'm sticking with it. But along my career, depending on how I talk to students, I talk about it as a journey of great pride. Because if you look back and forward in the history of our profession, you can see fingerprints of our profession in about every major policy change there is over the course of centuries. From leadership in foster care and child welfare and adoption, to our profession leading around income supports, consumer protections, protection against child labor. Charles asked me if I was going to get an apartment in DC because I spend a lot of time here. One of our alums from the Brown School is leading the entire effort for the nation and around the globe around human trafficking. We honored her as a distinguished alum, Dr. Castro, just last year at our school. Our social work profession has led major efforts in terms of reducing maternal and infant mortality, having available social insurance, employment protections, women's rights, civil rights, major poverty initiatives, housing fairness, elderly care. I could go on. And I'm grateful to have social work colleagues in each one of those spaces. So Charles, I will suggest that our profession has made mighty differences in those larger social agendas. Sometimes we get credit for them, and largely we are on the ground organizing voter drives and bringing people to polls and doing what, for example, my colleague Robert Hawkins is in the room from New York University, and myself and colleagues did, which is bring our students to Capitol Hill with policy briefs and new tools in hand to influence the agenda. But my newest mission, first in collaboration with the McSilver Institute and now with Clark Fox Policy Institute, is really be sure that we are also the public face of a set of issues that we really care about as a profession. And so I will challenge us to think hard about how all of our schools are truly educating for the full social work profession, to be prepared to work with people, but also to be prepared to be true leaders in the environment. And that's the policy arena as well. And so one of the things that I'm incredibly proud of is that faculty like Tim McBride, who is also in the room, Michael, have put out a set of social work, both practitioners, academics, who have combined their content knowledge about our profession with a real set of policy tools. And you're going to hear about one of those policy initiatives today that I think could make a huge difference for kids and their families. And I'm also really, in collaboration with so many others, trying to get our social work students to be incredibly interested to move to DC, to move to their state capitals, and to run for offices themselves. I think we need the content knowledge now more than ever out of our profession. And so I'm happy to be one of those folks that are trying to actually encourage all of us to move towards greater and public-facing policy strengths within our profession. But having said that, Charles, I think we've done a lot. And Michael and colleagues, Rick is one of the authors as well, Rick Barth, have actually chronicled those policy successes in a book around the grand challenges. These are solvable grand challenges that can really actually, our profession, along with so many others, really make some very significant headway in. So with that, I'm going to really actually turn this over to the real talent. My colleague, Michael Sherrodden. Michael is an esteemed faculty member at the Brown School. He also directs the Center for Social Development at our school. You can't keep up with Michael in terms of energy, in terms of commitment, in terms of passion, not only for our profession, but also for unyielding focus on promoting the intersection between scholarship and impact. And that's what you're going to hear about today, is a policy initiative that I think could make a huge difference. And because I would like Michael to retire before he's 150, I think he's going to probably make a direct ask for our involvement in some of these initiatives that he's going to talk about today. So with that, please welcome Michael Sherrodden.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Charles. It's a great pleasure to be here. I want to. This work is, Mary gives me too much credit. This work has been done by lots of people. You sort of don't manage to get surface any kind of academic work in the real world without huge efforts by lots of people. It's impossible to mention all those people in this introduction, but it certainly wasn't me that made this happen. It was a significant team effort. The panelists who come up here are part of this large group, and you'll see that all of them are impressive. I'll introduce them, and I'll make a few remarks and then introduce them. I thank Mary for the review of policy contributions by social workers. I think Mary's absolutely right about these really significant policy contributions. She mentioned Hull House. The women at Hull House pretty much outlined everything that got enacted in the New Deal, 30 years later, 20, 30 years later. These are some of my professional heroes, and among others, and this was incredible contributions. Really, they wrote the agenda for what became the New Deal, the Social Security Act, and then other social workers during the 30s enacted. I mean, it was Frances Perkins, first woman who was Secretary of Labor. Wilbur Cohen, who was my professor, worked in the White House and had a major role in creating the Social Security Act. So this is social workers have always been doing policy, but Charles also is right, because recently we haven't been up to our game. I mean, this is really true. For some reason, over the last couple decades, we haven't been as much involved in policy, but I think that's changing. The leadership in the national organizations in social work and the deans around the country are really, and Darla Coffey is here, the head of CSWE. Really, the leadership's great, and I'm really encouraged by that. And I also have the privilege of working with the team for the grand challenges of social work. Rick Barth deserves huge credit for helping get that off the ground, and leading the office where that is executed from, with a major national effort. And this is the grand challenges for social work, sort of lays out challenges and re-energizes the policy focus for in these areas. So you can think about this program today as being one small part of the grand challenges, because child accounts are proposed as one of the directions in actually a couple of the grand challenges. I don't know how that happened, but anyway, so social work, we have a lot to do. Certainly can't rest on our laurels, but social work should have a really proud history here, and we can be equally as active as the women of Hull House. And it would be nice if there was something like a Hull House that charted the social policies for the 21st century. So maybe that's you guys. Let's figure out where that next Hull House will be. All right. I have just a few minutes today, and as Mary indicated, we've been working on asset building for quite a long time now, and usually I talk about some particular part of this work. But this venue is a little different. It's pretty wide scope, and I have very little time to talk with you. So I'm just going to try to make a few key points about what this is about. The origins of this work started with a proposal, really a focus on that we should be thinking about households building assets and not just income support. Income support, really the dominant idea of social policy in the 20th century. A great idea. So, and this is really not a comment about income support not being terrific, and certainly we would never propose, reducing income support in any way or harming the great program, Social Security, at the front of that list. But in addition to that, households also need to be building assets. So that was 30 years ago a pretty different idea, and took quite a long time just to get that idea on the table, have a discussion, and we've made some progress in doing that. So now people do talk about assets. Social researchers measure assets, and asset inequalities have become, the wealth gap has become a common term. Signa Mary McKernan is here at the Urban Institute. She leads a lot of this research at the Urban Institute. And Willie Elliott's here, who I'll introduce in a minute. Willie also playing a major role in leading that research. So this idea has taken a long time to develop, but the original proposal was, well, let's start asset building for everybody at birth. And so it was a kids account idea, although at the time we didn't call it kids accounts. It was like lifelong idea. So this work, long story short, this work that we're talking about here today is really coming out of that initial vision about where all this could go. And it really is the idea that lifelong asset building is an important policy. We do have asset building policies in America, really substantial ones, but poor people don't participate. So what the point here is not that we want to create something for the poorest children, something new. Not really. What we would like to do is bring the poorest children into the same policies that are benefit the rest of the population. So asset building for everyone, and particularly asset building for people who are impoverished and for people of color, because these populations have been excluded, and I will say systematically excluded from the ability to accumulate those assets. So this is also the social justice point, which really only social workers bring this clarity more than any other group about what's happened here with our history, how have people been excluded, and what can we do to not make that right, but provide some remedy so people can improve their well-being going forward. So that's the bigger context of the discussion. Okay, so we propose asset building and kids accounts, and why do we propose kids accounts specifically? One point is that we have really good evidence now from a very nice long-running research project, experimental research. This is truly scientific research, random assignment in a full population. These kinds of projects are quite rare. And we've been running this research for 11 years, so we have some very clear outcomes published in very good journals, I'm glad to say, that having an account for kids is good for the kids. They have better social development. It appears to be good for the parents. The parents have a more positive outlook on their kids' educational opportunities and possibilities, and a number of other positive effects. I don't want to overstate this. It's not like this is a solution to everything, but you get, for a relatively small investment, you get a series of positive effects on child development and family development, and the money really hasn't even been spent yet. The money is still accumulating for that child's education. So these are pretty interesting results from a social policy experiment. And as a result of this evidence, we now have 6 states with some form of child development accounts statewide. 2 of those states are opening accounts for every baby at birth, and Colleen Quint is here from Maine, and you'll hear more about that. Pennsylvania also opening an account for every child at birth now, and we're in discussions regularly with other states. I testified in Salem, Oregon last week. Margaret Clancy from my staff testified in Lincoln, Nebraska a couple weeks ago, and there are discussions in Washington State and in California and other places. Really, this is a really energetic and growing discussion in America. So we're here today to talk about a possible federal facilitation of a policy energy that's already happening at the state and city level, also a bunch of city policies around the country. I want to make this point. This is kind of an academic point, but it has real world implications. This is a structural idea, and it requires thinking about it in a structural way. So if you set up a social policy that changes distributions of assets, it's not really really going for an individual solution. You're really going for setting up a structure so that things can be better for more people. It's more like I think about creating a universal child development account. It's like plumbing. Run the pipes to every house, or like highways. Put the highways out there so people can get from here to there. But the trouble is we actually, and I'll get to this point. He's a busy dean. It's all right. It's all right, Rick. The trouble is we actually, I'm going to get to this point. We actually have this plumbing in America, and I'll talk about that. We haven't hooked up all the houses to the plumbing. We're not running the water to every household. So I will argue that we have this, and it's a public good, and we should take advantage of it. It's the college savings plan structure, where all the states that now have statewide programs are using this structure, and college savings plans that have so far. This has been a really regressive public policy. 5 minutes. It's hard to talk for 20 minutes if you're a professor. All right, I'll just try to make a couple points and get out of the way. It's hard to think about the 529 structure is like all the asset building policies we have in America. It's like, my retirement account, tax deferrals, home mortgage interest tax deduction. These all benefit mostly people at the top. These are large public expenditures. We're talking about in these public expenditures through the tax system, we're talking about probably now over $500 billion a year. We're over $500 billion a year. Almost all this money, 90% of it goes to the top 10% of the population. Actually, most of it goes to the top 1% of the population. So we have these policies. We transfer, if you think about the plumbing, we move a lot of water through the pipes, but that water is not going to every house. So the sensible public policy, Signa Mary will talk more about this, that policy structure exists, and that's why we're so interested in using a 529. So the 529 structure has been regressive, it's been exclusive, so only a few people participate, and they're wealthy people, or they're college professors like me. I put money in there for my kids and my grandkids, but poor people don't benefit from this. It's important to understand, I get tax subsidies, I get public benefits for saving for my kids' education. And do poor people get the same public benefits? And then you have to ask, well, what kind of public policy is this? Is this sensible public policy? Well, no, not really. And then in the context of this discussion, do we have an alternative? Yes, we do. We have a structure there. Think about it as the plumbing, a public good. It's already there. You don't have to rebuild it. What you have to do is put people in it. And once people are in it, all kinds of things are possible. Because you can begin to ask questions like, well, we have several $100 billion a year in asset building policy in America, but why don't we make that like fair, like everybody gets the same amount? And if everybody's hooked up to the plumbing, then you can say, well, let's move a little more of the water over here from over there. It becomes a much easier discussion. It also becomes possible to begin to address historical injustices. So I think, for example, a discussion about reparations, I'm in favor of some form of compensation to populations that have been enslaved, killed in large numbers. And we're talking about African Americans for sure, but we're also talking about certainly about Native Americans and the clarity of the history of Hispanic Americans in American history is becoming a little clearer. Really very similar, very negative history about white colonization of this continent, being really just taking people's livelihoods and taking their lives. So these are discussions that are beginning to become heard in America. If there's a policy structure that you could actually do something about it with, then it becomes much more possible to say, well, yes, let's educate. Let's educate all of our children, not just the privileged children, and not just the white children. Let's educate all of our children. Let's put some money in these accounts for all these children. Okay, so that's my perspective. I've run out of time, and I'm going to introduce our panelists. Thank you. Okay, so Mary McKay is going to be the first panelist to respond. Our Signa Mary McKay. McKernan, sorry. I knew I was. I knew I was something wrong. They're sitting together. I'll be my excuse. Signa Mary McKernan I worked with for a long time. We co-edited a book along the way. She's been working in this area, doing great work from the Urban Institute. She holds some important offices over there. She's a vice president for the Center on Labor and Human Services and Population, and she's a co-director for the Opportunity and Ownership Initiative at the Urban Institute, which she helped create. Thank you. So Signa Mary will comment. Another panelist is Willie Elliott. Willie is a professor at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. He's now the director of the Joint Doctoral Degree Program at University of Michigan. I have to say, I was a graduate of the Joint Doctoral Degree Program, and Willie was actually my doctoral student, and now he's the head of the doctoral program that I graduated from. And now I learn more from Willie than he learns from me. So there's some kind of circular logic in that, but I don't know quite what it is. But anyway, Willie is terrific. He's been a real leader in this field, focusing especially on asset accumulation education for children. And Colleen Quint is the director of the Alphons Scholarship Foundation in Maine, and the Alphon Fund created the first universal automatic kids account in the country, and Colleen knows more about this than anyone, and we're delighted she's here. We hope that a lot more states start to look like Maine in the years going forward. So those three panelists, if you three will come up, and we'll respond. The order of the respondents will be first Signa Mary McKernan, then Willie Elliott, and then Colleen Quint.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and Michael Sherraden has been a mentor and a collaborator and a friend, and I've learned so much from him. I think I started in this area from the credit or the debt side of it, access to credit, and really learned a lot about the asset building side from Michael. So I'd like to put child development accounts into the broader perspective, thinking about wealth inequality in the United States, and then also federal policy. And I would like to leave you with three main points. One, that wealth is not just for the wealthy. Two, that wealth inequality is a barrier to education. And three, that family savings policies can help. So starting with wealth is not just for the wealthy. So the U.S. economy has been growing steadily for decades. You know, our country as a whole is doing really well, but some boats are rising more than others. And our country, so we're wealthier now than we've ever been, but wealth inequality is increasing, and it's mainly the people at the top who are benefiting. So wealth and prosperity are not trickling down to the middle or to the lower classes or lower income families. But this isn't inevitable. There are policies like children's savings accounts that can change this. So our 9 charts, our Urban Institute's 9 charts about wealth inequality, we use the best data available to look at wealth inequality in the United States over the past 50 years. And you can see these charts online, and you see some really interesting things, even just with respect to the middle class, never mind lower income families. So if we look back in 1963, high wealth families, and there I'm talking about families that are at the 90th percentile. So 90% of families have less wealth, but they're not the super wealthy, right? There's still 10% that have more. And those higher wealth families had 6 times the wealth of the middle family, the family at the median. So that was 6 times in 1963. By 2016, they had 12 times the wealth. So think about what that means for you, for your children, for your grandchildren, the difference that it can make over the course of your life. If I have $12 for every $1 you have, when an emergency happens and you want that a little cushion to get through that emergency, when you want to help your child with a down payment on a home, or your grandchild with college tuition, wealth is where economic opportunity lies. And wealth inequality, it matters for everyone, not just people at the lower end of the wealth distribution, and that is because a strong and thriving middle class is important for our economy. And inequality weakens our economy, it increases crime, and it results in a less educated population. So turning to the second point, that wealth inequality is a barrier to education and to social mobility. This U.S. wealth gap that I've just been talking about is fueling an education gap in the United States. In addition to income, wealth can buy educational attainment, right? We've seen it literally with the scandal, but even before then, it can buy tutors and books and private schools, even before you get to college. But wealth is different from income, as Michael's said before. It's bringing something that income and financial aid alone can't bring. So our Urban Institute research finds significant differences between young people based on their family's wealth when they were 18. So we look at them when they're 18, and then we follow them over time and watch their educational attainment. And that's after controlling for income. So this is above and beyond income, family demographics, and other factors. And what we find is that young people from high wealth families are more than 1.5 times as likely to complete a 2 or a 4-year degree from college as children from lower wealth families. And among families that in which the parents did not graduate college, so those first-generation college students, young people from high wealth families are 2 times more likely to complete that 2nd or 4-year degree. So in terms of that's where we're seeing that social mobility. And because education is a key way to escape poverty and to gain economic independence, increasing access to wealth can then increase access to opportunity. That's why I was saying wealth is where economic opportunity lies. And that's particularly for Black and Hispanic families who, through no fault of their own, have less wealth than white families. But the cards are stacked against these families, and this is what Michael was alluding to with federal wealth building subsidies. They're stacked even against middle-income families in the United States. And typically for federal policy, we talk a lot about middle income because that sometimes is what changes policy. So it's up the income spectrum. So today's upside-down federal subsidies for asset building, they are exacerbating this disparity in wealth that we're seeing. The federal government spends billions of dollars every year on long-term asset building, such as through the mortgage interest tax deduction and through preferential treatment of retirement savings accounts. But because these subsidies go through the tax code, they primarily benefit high-income families. So today's young Americans, our current generations, who tend to have lower incomes because they're just starting out, they're not getting this foothold in the American dream that previous generations have had. And that's, we're seeing that in our data. And so to the third point, what can we do about this? Policymakers who are looking to promote evidence-based opportunity should be looking to match savings accounts. Because family savings policy, it shows promise for both financial security and then also for social mobility. So at a time when Americans are worried about their finances and policymakers are looking for a way to provide a hand up, not just a hand out, this is a way to do it. And you might say, oh, but they can't save, right? A common misconception is that low income or even poor families with low income or who don't have money at the time, can't save. But evidence from savings programs and from research shows that they can. So we have a random control trial evaluation at Urban Institute that we have underway too. And this found that individual development accounts, IDAs, can lead to substantial new savings for low-income participants, approximately $650 just in the first year, and usually it takes a couple of years of savings. And so to be clear, that $650, that's new savings. That's not coming from the match. When we look at it, so what we did is it's the Assets for Independence program. And this IDA initiative, evaluated at the Urban Institute, it uses federal and non-federal funds to match personal savings that can then be used for home ownership, for a small business, and then for education and training. So, for example, a participant might receive a $4 match for every $1 that they save, up to about $1,000. And they also get an account and some financial education about that. And then early results from this random control trial evaluation show that the AFI IDAs help participants save for the future, but also while protecting their financial security, they actually had lower material hardship while they were doing this savings. So the boost in savings is critical for low-income families. It's a $650 difference, but participants had about $900, and then people who didn't participate had saved a little bit over $200. So that's how we get to that $650 difference. And with this savings, we know from other research, too, that even a small amount of savings, from $250 to $750, can make a big difference when one of those unexpected events happens in your life. And 60% of Americans will have one of these events happen in their life in a year, whether it's your car breaking down, an unexpected medical bill, volatile income, your income dropping. But what we find is that Assets for Independence IDA participants, they saw a reduction in hardships related to participants' inability to pay for their utilities, for their housing, or for their medical expenses. We also saw an improvement in their confidence. They felt more financially secure, more like that they could meet their monthly living expenses. And one possible reason that these IDAs are so successful is that the new savings in them are not subject to asset limits in our means-tested programs. So families will save more money if they don't have to worry about whether or not they'd still be eligible for our safety net in the future. And other Urban Institute research finds that asset limits, they have unintended consequences, that food stamp asset limits reduce financial security and stability in low-income households by decreasing their savings and also decreasing the likelihood that they have a bank account. And indeed, with the Assets for Independence IDA evaluation, we found also a decrease in check cashing, going to the alternative financial sector to cash your checks, suggesting that households are more likely to participate in the mainstream financial sector, that plumbing that Michael was talking about. So just to summarize, wealth is not just for the wealthy. Wealth inequality is a barrier to education, and family savings policies can help.
I prepared some copious notes for this event, so let me get them out. Hopefully it'll work. Thanks, Michael, for letting me be here. I mean, Michael's been my mentor for years now, over a decade. We're all getting old at this point, but very excited to be here. So I'm also time challenged, so I won't spend too much time in small talk. But I want to say, I'm going to try to put the research in context. There's too much research, and that's one of my points right now, is that like there's a growing body of evidence around CSAs. And this is not the case with all policies that we have. Many policies we adopt without very much evidence at all. And so it would be impossible for me in 10 minutes to go through all the studies and provide all the evidence and do it justice. And so I'm going to provide you a little bit of context and tell you some stories. And hopefully they will enlighten you about the findings in data. I want to start off by saying that you really do need to think about the CSA research within a context, right? And I want to give you the student loan program as one way of thinking about it. When we adopted the student loan program, when I started studying, I wrote a book on student debt, right? And when I started studying it, I thought, wow, man, there must have been a vast amount of evidence to lead to the adoption of student loan program. But I actually found out that there wasn't, right? It really was a matter of conservatives wanted no federal funding to be involved in funding education and no grants. And progressives wanted grants to fund education. And so the compromise was student loans, which no one thought would actually be used because it had some basic policies around student debt in private schools, and nobody really used them. But it turned out that people really wanted it and ended up using them. But my point is this, is that it wasn't like it was built on this large body of evidence. And that's why they adopted the policy. However, we are doing, and particularly Center for Social Development and others, are doing great work in building this large body of evidence to give us confidence in the policy that we're going into, in the direction we're going into. The other thing with student loans is it gives you, and I tend to think of research in this way at different stages. And I think this is the great thing about CSAs and also the hard thing to sell sometimes because they become a solution for everything to some people, and that can be problematic. But on the same time, the way I think about them is early education, college enrollment, college completion, and then post-college outcomes. And I think we should think about financial aid that way, and I think the CSA research has evolved in that way. So we have research in all these areas. The early education research, because the program's relatively new, are the randomized control trial data and the stuff on that lines. The later data, except for we do have David here, who's done some work in Italy, and they now have some randomized control data around children's savings accounts in college enrollment. But a lot of that in the US context has been more correlational evidence around national data sets. But the point is that in each one of these buckets, CSAs show promise of having impact on kids' lives, right, and on families' lives. And so I think this is a really important way to think about it. With regard to student loans, quickly, what we know about student loans is that early on, some students are averse to taking out debt, right? Particularly minority students. They tend to be more averse to taking out debt. And so that can actually reduce the number of kids who go to college. Once they're in college, some kids begin to see the accumulation of debt and are more likely to drop out of college because of debt. So, and then once they leave college, right, it affects the return on a degree. Now, there's debate within the literature around this, but typically when we look at the case that I like to look at, that is kids who have graduated from college with debt and without debt, we tend to find that they have lower wealth, they buy homes later, and many other things along those lines. And so if we're really thinking about how we're going to finance education, we have one model in which it seems to be almost working against what we're trying to do. And so one of the beauties to me around the CSA research and around CSAs is it really harmonizes and works together with our Head Start programs and our tutoring and all these other things that we're trying to do along the way to get kids there. It's not a replacement for those things, but it's one of those interventions that actually works well with all of these things at once. It's a connective tissue, right, throughout the pipeline. So I think that's tremendously important to think about. And we could talk about, in questions and answers, kind of the research in each one of these areas. But it's important for you to understand is that we have positive outcomes all along this pipeline when we think about children's savings accounts and we think about asset building. And it's a different kind of model. Where I really want to hone in for my last little bit of talk is kind of where I started off in my research. And that's around the idea that CSAs have the potential for building hope in families. And I think that's really important. We talk about them in the research area about expectations and things like that. But one of the reasons why even small dollar accounts that start off very early and don't have lots of money in them in the beginning and that build money over time, one of the things they can do is change the way we think about our futures. This is something Michael proposed in his book early on, that it could change the way people's outlooks about things, and I think this is really important. So a couple little stories. One story is, and I won't bore you with kind of all the details of my life, but I'm a high school dropout. I was homeless for periods of times, and one of the things my mother and I would always do was drive through other neighborhoods, right? And while it was like almost a survival mechanism in some ways, because we would look at those houses that seem so large to us and dream one day of being in one of those houses, right? And that's a type of hope. In the research world, I think about that as an aspiration, right? We have aspirations for ourselves. But the thing about that hope was neither one of us really thought that we could achieve it, right? We dreamed about it to help us get through a miserable day, but we had no rational reasons around us to suggest that we could ever accomplish that, right? And so the one thing about, so it's more aspirational in nature. So the one thing about CSAs is they provide us with a kind of a tangible hope, right? The hope that I had going in that neighborhood wasn't based on anything real, right? There was no structures there to get me there. However, and at the time I wasn't even going to school that much but nonetheless, so there was really nothing there for that. But what the CSAs do is they provide us with a type of tangible hope. What I mean by that is if you get the plumbing in place, right? If every kid has an account, and we understand how accounts work, right? That if you save over time, you accumulate wealth, and at the end you'll have more wealth. It provides, and beyond that, right? So this is what they can do with their own savings, but I think Michael and I both would say it's not about that individual savings per se, but it's a matter that now they have a structure in place that we can pump other resources into that in addition to their own savings to really build for their futures. And so this hope that we see in the evidence is not like hope that is like irrational in some way, right? That you have to be extremely self-efficacious to believe in it. My I can do belief would be so extremely large that even in the face of all difficulties, I believe anyhow. No, it's not that, because most of us don't have that, right? Most of us look at our world and say, can I achieve it based upon the circumstances around me, right? And that should be what we expect of people, not that there be some superhuman that overcomes all the things that are against them and somehow makes it, right? And so what the CSAs do, and I'll be wrapping up here, is they provide a tangible hope. They give people grounds for believing that college can be for them, right? And we've seen evidence in the randomized control trials with increased parental expectations. We've seen it in correlation data with children, that children have higher expectations, that these things that have benefits for them. So there are reasons to believe that these child savings accounts, provide people with a reason to believe they, through their work and effort, because they have the institutional structure in place, can achieve some semblance of the American dream. And then beyond that, it's working together with the other things that we already have in place, whether it be our Head Start programs, whether it be our education system or whatever else. And then also it allows us not only for families to contribute, but then for us to think about third parties contributing and other people contributing to these accounts. So it provides a mechanism to really build that wealth for them so that they can achieve their goals. We could talk more about the evidence later. I won't take up any of Colleen's time, but hopefully that gives you some idea of things. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So I'm Colleen, and I'm from Maine, and it's terrific to be here today. I've worked with Michael and with Willie for many years. Certainly am very familiar with the work that Signa Mary and folks at the Urban Institute do. And where the earlier speakers were focused on research and policy and theory, I think I'm here to kind of anchor the conversation in a bit of practice and tell you what a program actually looks like and how it came to be and what we think we're about and how we're going about it. So the program that we have in Maine, we invest $500 at birth for every child born a Maine resident, and it's for their future education. We invest it in a 529 account. So the very piece that Michael was talking about earlier, about the plumbing is in place, and the question is, do we get the plumbing to every household? That's what we're trying to do in Maine. So every child born what we call a Maine resident, so someone who comes on vacation doesn't count, right? But every Maine resident baby, we invest that $500 at birth. And we do a lot of work to make sure families know about that and to work with partners that I'd be happy to speak about later on. But the way that I describe the work that I do is about creating opportunity for Maine kids through access to higher education. And when the program was founded, really the The impetus behind it, again, Michael's reference to asset building is, and kind of the theory and the work certainly that all of you do in social work and the asset building fields. In Maine, with our particular program, the notion of asset building was honestly a little bit different than that. So our program was founded by a gentleman named Harold Alfond, who was a businessman and a philanthropist. This program came about because he would write a check every time a grandchild was born in the family. He wrote a check for $500 and put it into a savings account for that grandchild's future education. And one day, Mr. Alfond said, "Why shouldn't every Maine baby have what my grandchildren have?" And he wanted it in a 529 because that was the way that money was most likely to grow over time and build assets for those families. He just kind of came at it, I think, a little bit differently than maybe a lot of folks in this room might be thinking of it. But the result is the same, and the result is pretty fantastic. In the next month or two, in either June or July, depending on how many babies are actually born in the next couple of months, we will hit $50 million invested for 100,000 Maine children. And Maine has like 1.2 million people in the whole state. So, when you think about the scope and the scale of that, $50 million and 100,000 kids is a pretty great thing to be part of, I have to say. One of the things that I really love about the program, too, is, Willie uses the phrase hope in tangible form. The way that I often talk about it in our program in Maine is that it has both practical and aspirational benefits. So Mainers are very practical, right? I haul wood in from the barn and put it in the wood stove, and, we're kind of practically minded, grounded folks. And so the practical benefit is there is real money in a real account for these children. It's an omnibus account that we opened on behalf of all the babies, and we put the money in. We hold the money. We'll do the distribution of the funds. But every quarter, those families receive a statement from us or a summary that shows the value of that child's Alfond grant, and it has the child's name on it. So it goes to mom, and it says, Tommy's $500 Alfond grant is now worth $592.87, or whatever it might be. As long as the markets are doing well, of course. And then we also include in that communication we send to families information and resources. So we have tips that are age appropriate across different content areas. We've developed a website that has a planning tool that parents can use to support their child's development, opportunities for information about how they can open their own accounts to make contributions, which many families have done. So this notion of kind of working with the families to create what Willie and others refer to as that college-bound identity is a big part of what we're really trying to do. So it has that practical benefit of real money in a real account. And when the family gets that communication in the mail or via email, because they can get it electronically as well, then it becomes not only practical but aspirational. So families who never thought of their child as being somebody who might pursue education after high school or want that for their child but have no idea how they're going to help them get there because they don't have the financial means, see that money and say, well, that's a start. And Mainers are pretty good at cobbling things together. Nobody has the money for college sitting in an account right there to write one big check. I mean, it's not even 1% of the population in Maine can do that. But we cobble things together, and that's a start. And there is something about, and we've heard many parents talk about this when we do focus groups, that somebody else believes in my child. Somebody else believes in my child's future. And that's incredibly, incredibly empowering. So it's a neat thing to be part of. When the program first started, we were opt-in. So families were required to open their own 529 account by the child's first birthday. And the notion that Mr. Alfond had behind that was that he wanted families to have skin in the game. We're going to give you $500. We want you to open an account so that you can then add your own money in as you're able to. What we found after the first 5 years was a little over 40% of families were opening accounts, which was a fantastic outcome by almost any measure, right? Nationally, it's about 4% of families that have an account like that. But 40% was not what Mr. Alfond had in mind. So what we discovered was we found a way to create what we call the universal accounts, or an omnibus account, so that we invest the money on behalf of those children based on state data around how many babies were born in Maine in a given month. There's about 12,000 babies born in Maine each year, by the way. And so in 2013, technically in 2014, on what would have been Mr. Alfond's 100th birthday, we announced that we were making the program statewide, automatic, universal at birth. We had been statewide at birth, but it was opt-in the first 5 years. And I've been in this particular field for about 5 years now. I came on board in January of 2014, and March was when we had the big announcement. And one of the first things I did after that was come here to DC for a conference that Prosperity Now was hosting. And Willie was on a panel, and Michael was there, and Margaret was there. Our program was kind of the buzz because it was an asset building conference focused on children's savings account, and we had just made, like 2 weeks before, the big announcement about moving to statewide and automatic, and that was, for me, I have to say, coming in new to the field, incredibly energizing too. It was the moment when you're taken out of your own context. You're like, oh, this is really a pretty big deal, and this is something that a lot of folks have some energy behind. And so what I found in the intervening years is that there are a lot of other programs around the country, some with a similar model to us, others with different models. Some use 529, some use checking accounts, some are at birth, some are at kindergarten. There are different variations on the theme, but all fundamentally about creating opportunity for kids through access to education and through access to building assets. And so now, just last week, I was on the phone with someone from Santa Cruz, California, who was looking to develop a program, and somebody in Canada called because they have a program they're interested in learning from what we've done. And we inform other programs, and other programs inform us. It's an incredibly collegial field, and the opportunity to work with each other and learn from each other, whether it's around the research piece or the policies within our own programs, or just what are the ideas that folks have about how to better connect with families and engage them in the work. We just did a new strategic plan for our program last spring, and where before we had been focused on kind of 3 areas of work: enrollment, when we were opt-in, we wanted to get families signed up; family savings, because that's an important part for us as families build their own assets and connect with the opportunity; and then what we call education messaging, those quarterly statements that we send out that show folks the value of the grant and help them tap into other resources. And now we've kind of expanded that view a little bit. So the next few years, our focus is on awareness. We want to make sure families really know that they have the grant and understand how it works, all part of better effectuating that college-bound identity. We want to focus on engaging with families in different ways. I'm a one-person shop, so there's one of me and right now 94,000 babies. And so what are the ways that we can engage with those families, have them feel that connection to us and the connection to the grant in a way that's personal and motivational to them. When you're connected to something, when you feel engaged and energized by it, you're going to roll with it, you're going to do something with it. So we want to find ways to do that. Where we want to really be working on aspirations. So this last fall was a really important moment for our program. Our oldest of the universal babies, as we call them, the ones who are automatically awarded the grant, arrived in Maine's kindergartens. And so we did an initiative statewide, working with schools across the state to mark the arrival of universal babies in kindergarten. We sent out an invitation to participate to all Maine elementary schools. There's a couple of hundred of them, 300, I think. And we had 50 of them respond to say, we want to be a champion school. And each of those 50 schools identified what they were going to do to create a college-going culture starting in kindergarten with their students. And these are schools in Maine that are very impoverished, in very rural communities that have 12 kids in the kindergarten class, and schools in larger districts with many families and with many families from many different cultures and many different countries, and working with those families as well to create that sense of hope and future. And then the family savings continues to be the 4th anchor point for us because we see the power of that. And to date, so like I mentioned, the foundation has right now invested $47 million, so like I said, the next 3 or 4 months, we should hit that $50 million mark. But Maine families have contributed of their own funds $68 million so far. And again, I know that I've made this point several times, but Maine is not a wealthy state. This is not a state where folks have a ton of resources. It's not even a highly educated state. There are a couple of pockets of higher education among the adult population, but frankly, not very many. And that's part of the view of the program, right? So we talked before about the aspirational and practical benefits. for us, and the impetus behind our program is also about the micro and the macro. The micro level is the opportunity for each individual child through the aegis of this grant to think and maybe potentially access something different in their future. But the macro level benefit is about creating a more diverse and educated workforce for our state in ways that will really, really help the economy prosper over time. And so it's like I said, it's a pretty great thing to be part of, and happy to be here today to talk with you about it. Thank you.
Well, I'm incredibly inspired by both my colleague Michael and our panelists. I want to work with all of those universal families to connect them and really help them create those opportunities. Our panelists each refer to the limited amount of time that they have. So they have a lot more to say to you, but now it's up to you to ask them some questions and to bring out a more fuller discussion of some of the issues. And so can I ask you to step up? We have a mic right up here. Is that the only one we have in the room, Charles? Yeah, okay. Come on down, as they say in the game shows, and we'd love to take some questions and get the discussion going. Please.
Hi, I'm Robert Hawkins from NYU.
Very good.
So I have a question. Among the many things that I do, including bringing my master's students here, I direct our undergraduate program. And we have an undergraduate degree in social work and many other programs. And one of my biggest frustrations is working with particularly low income, but also middle income students who they were told by the university that we cover 100% of your need. And I'm sure other schools say that too. And what that means is we cover 100% of the need that we told you you need. And so there's always a gap. And any additional funds that they receive, that is counted against them. So if there's a $15,000 gap, and I've had lower and higher, when they go to the university, if they can identify maybe an outside source, an uncle or grandpa, who can help them close that gap, that's counted against their financial aid. So it means that then they get less aid. So they actually end up with still a gap. So there are many ways to think about this, and I know many states have made community college free, so that will allow someone to go, instead of a 4-year college to a 2-year college, they can go to a 4-year college for 2 years. But my question is, given that a lot of your ideas, which I think are great ideas, and I have a 529 for my kids as well, they butt against university policy or even federal policy.
Yep.
And are there other ways to fight back or push back against your great ideas when they run into policy? What do we do?
So thoughts about that, please.
I'm just going to say that that's what I was mentioning about unintended consequences by discouraging savings, right? And so that's asset limits or some of these tests. And so there have been policy proposals, at least with means-tested programs, to eliminate those asset tests when you're taking them. But so it's happening in food stamps. It's discouraging savings. It's discouraging having an account at all. And so now you're seeing it at higher education.
Willie, do you have something? So I think, I've been coming to DC less time than Michael has, but for the last decade. And one of the things, we tend to think from within the existing system and not understand that that's a policy decision, and therefore can be changed. And so part of our effort and our job is to begin helping people see why assets are relevant and important for low-income people to build, and that we need to have policies, generally speaking, that afford them the opportunity to build those assets. But that's a policy that can be shifted and changed. but we needed, and I think Michael's been doing the work for a long time, of educating people on why it's important in that through income alone, people aren't able to lift themselves out of poverty. But the assets are a real fundamental part of being able to have a productive life. And so I think it is a policy challenge, but one that we can overcome.
I would just say specifically, Robert, to your very good question. It's my understanding, Margaret Clancy's in the room, and she can answer this more clearly than I can if she wants to speak up. But it's my understanding that savings in 529 affects college aid decisions very little in terms of the kind of offsetting that you're talking about. But I don't know enough about that exactly. Margaret, do you want to add a word?
In the first year, it doesn't affect it. It's the subsequent.
Okay.
We would just.
These are the kinds of conversations we want to generate across audience members, absolutely.
Thank you. We did do a policy brief on this topic. The most important thing is in the Carroll Delphine College Challenge, in the Seed for Oklahoma Kids experiment that we began in 2007 in the state of Maine. The money is in the name of the state in Carroll Delphine College Challenge. It's in the name of the foundation, and the money will go directly to the higher educational institution. And so in these kind of instances, then that money doesn't pass through the family, so it should not count against the federal financial aid.
And I just, if the moderator can just speak about policy too, I don't know if that's against the rules, but there's a set of policies that are federal, but there's a set of institutional policies that we also who live in higher education are living within those, and we often don't make those the targets of our advocacy or our attempts to policy change. And yet, I think as higher education, we have a big responsibility to talk about the importance of no loan. For example, I spend a lot of time with our administration talking about no loan public service graduate programs like our School of Social Work. And so there's a number of ways that we need to push at this policy agenda, and it's not all governmental. It's also the institutions that employ us and educate our students.
I'll say one more thing real quickly.
Yeah.
And part of the thing is we haven't had the impetus or the reason in some ways to challenge some of these policies, because most low-income people don't have savings that is built up for college. But as these programs become more popular, there's more reason to change these policies and talk about these policies.
Correct. Please.
Good morning. My name is Linda Granger. I'm a graduate student at Bryn Mawr, and I'm curious about how Maine is going to deal with the fact that just because a child is born in Maine, by the time they hit college, they may no longer be a Maine resident, and what happens with that funding? Or what happens, New Haven, which is where I've most recently lived, has New Haven First, which if a kid is in public school by 7th grade, they get the equivalent or tuition to UConn, but that doesn't address housing, room and board, books, lab fees, that kind of thing. So at $14,000 to $20,000 per institution, that still puts education out of the line of many residents.
So, great question, thank you. So a couple of things. In the Maine program that we have, if the child is born a Maine resident, we invest the $500 for them, and they are able to access that funds. They have until age 28 to use it. They can access that fund whether they continue to live in Maine or not, and they can use it at post-secondary institutions whether those institutions are in Maine or not. So really, the anchor point is you're born a Maine resident, and after that, the grant is there for you. Again, whatever it might have grown to over those intervening years. In terms of the myriad expenses connected with post-secondary education, I'd say two things. One is that the goal of our program was never to cover the cost of higher education. That was never the expectation or the intent. It was to put that $500, which really is enough to catch the attention of most Maine families. That's more money than they have in a savings account, because they probably don't even have a savings account. And so it's a way of kind of planting a seed and getting that started. With zero expectation it's going to cover all the costs. Having said that, we've seen a dynamic shift in higher education in this country in the last even 5 years around the ways that students of all kinds access post-secondary education. It is not, I would hazard a guess that each one of us on the panel went to a residential 4-year institution and that we stayed at that institution all 4 years or maybe transferred one time or something. But today, it's only like 20% of kids in the country who access higher education that way. The rest are doing it part-time, they're doing it at multiple institutions, they are cobbling together degrees, they're going online. So that little $500, which is, again, not so little for a lot of families and has the potential to grow over time, could in fact cover more of the pieces that are anticipated, more of the pieces of the cost than it might seem at first blush. But that's what we're trying to do, is just kind of get that started.
Beautiful. Additional, thanks, Rick.
So, great panel. Michael, you started the discussion about reparations and the connection to IDAs. As you think about the policy options that presidential candidates and all of us need to grapple with, some of them are focused more universally at this point, some of them on poor children, some of them specifically on African American children, as you say, maybe that should be broader to include Native American children and other children. But could you say more about where you think this might go and what this discussion might create as an opportunity for also expanding asset?
Thanks, Rick. I'm not an expert about this, but I've always thought that America really hasn't dealt with these issues yet, and either the genocide really of the native population here, or the enslavement for over 250 years of Africans on this land, and living off of all that wealth, and the taking of a piece of Mexico that doubled the size of the country. I mean, and then running people off the land after we took it. I mean, these are huge crimes, really. And the country, America, which we all love and believe in, hasn't really it made an honest statement, really, that, well, we did these things. So I think the country is just beginning to try to address this. It's encouraging that there are now presidential candidates that are willing to talk about some of these things that have been really under the rug for so long. So I think that's really hopeful. It's not that it cures this history, but an honest statement, and then an attempt to say, yes, we can all be Americans. We can develop together. In that context, would be really healthy for the nation. Hard, but healthy. So I think this century is hopeful in this regard. I do think that it's important. I think about this as nuts and bolts. The policy work is a lot about nuts and bolts. So I would say that the work that we're doing here potentially sets up a structure that makes a reparation possible. It's great for people to say, well, we should have reparations and we should spend, $200 billion on it. But politically, if there's not a believable way to do that it's going to be done in a way that actually reaches people, that it's in some kind of a form that enables that wealth to be passed along, politically, this is not going to be, not feasible. But maybe I'm too hopeful about this, but I think if you have a structure and say, well, look, all these children have accounts. Why don't we make a start here? And people could believe that this money is going into an account, and kids will be educated, and then they will buy homes, and they will become stronger citizens. I think that's a really possible political future for this idea. So that's what I would suggest.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Charita Castro, and I'm here personally, but I was a student of Michael's 20 years ago, and he introduced me to the Hull House and Francis Perkins. So I have two questions for you, Michael, and others. So one question is, and these are for the students. One question is about why should students who are not necessarily interested in a career in developing children's saving accounts learn about it and learn about domestic policy and opportunities for children if they're interested in international? Because it was my exposure to children's savings accounts that allowed me to think about inequalities for children internationally. And then the second one is on technology. I spent an entire summer with the wonderful Lissa Johnson with the Miss Ida account and learning about the technology. And as data science is one of the fastest growing fields, how can social workers partner with data scientists and technologies to use technology for good for the benefit of children?
That's awesome.
Oh, no, Michael, I believe that's directed.
Yeah, that's quite a student you have there, Michael. Yeah, really, the legacy you've left is amazing.
Thank you, Trina. She doesn't leave easy questions on the table, though. I will say a couple of things. I won't fully answer Trina's questions; they're too hard. But this idea actually happening in the children's accounts idea happening in other parts of the world now, and we're involved in a bunch of these discussions and policy initiatives in parts of Asia. And Fred Sewamala is down in the room, another person on this larger team now in our faculty. Fred is moving this work into Southern Africa and other parts of Africa, and other people doing that. And so this. I mean, my vision about children's accounts is that every baby in the world should be born, and they should get their immunizations, and they should get a birth certificate so they have a legal identity, and they should get an account. This is. I'm going to get to your technical question here. This is entirely doable. This is like we now have the technology to deliver this. If we just had the vision and the will to do it. So we have, and to technology, the technology, the data technology is now transforming financial services. You're all aware that, not that long from now, you won't be carrying, green money around in your pocket. It's too dirty, and it'll be just, electrons we're working with here. And much of the world, including the developing world, now has access to cell phone technology. And you can deliver financial services over cell phones now. And in much of the world, the United States is way behind on all this. In much of the world, that's how financial services are being delivered. So it's not pie in the sky to think every baby can be delivered an account in a very poor village anywhere. But that's a possibility. I think that technology really is there and can be worked with, and the so-called fintech people are moving that so quickly. So you can be confident that will be in place. It's a matter of then having the vision to hook up all these babies to this plumbing. And then imagine this world, every kid in the world has an account. What does international aid start to look like? International aid has a very bad history of a lot of money disappearing before it actually reaches people. But you could transfer with no loss, not 1 cent loss, resources, into accounts of every kid. So I know that also sounds a little bit, kind of crazy, but it's really not. It's really not. So there's a lot. The questions are good ones. They open up a lot of possibilities, and I think those possibilities will be there. Yeah.
I could touch quickly on the first part of the question. Why should some students care about it if they're not really studying, CSAs, are not going to use it? And I'm going to mention, maybe a shameless plug on some degree, Trina Shanks and I are working on a paper on white wealth inequality. And this will also circle into the last question that was asked. But one of the things I discovered in a book I was reading recently, that we don't have any data on white wealth inequality. It's a real thing. It exists. That there's white people who don't have assets, right? And that's important for us to understand, because it says we all have a reason to care about asset development, right? It's not just a black problem, but it's also a white problem. And so I think we need more of a discussion around that, and I'm very excited to get that work out, because I think we need to generate that conversation. One other quick comment. So that's why everybody should be concerned, because it affects us all, right? And it's not just an American problem, it's an international problem. And so we have to have collective energy around that. Lastly is there also needs the plumbing that Michael keeps talking about. We haven't talked about progressivity. So it might be that these reparations mean that some people get more assets pumped into these accounts than others, but all of us need assets pumped into these accounts, except for the select few.
That's terrific. Thank you. Please.
Thank you. Thank you all for speaking. It's really interesting to learn more about
policy. I'm a clinical student, so I'm kind of seeing the other side here. Michael brought up reparations, so I wanted to ask a question about how might you calculate that, because I know in US history is a little different. We don't necessarily have other countries pressuring us from the outside, so I think that it's really a problem that has to be resolved within the nation by the nation. So where would that, how they come from, how do you calculate it? And I guess by extension, I'm also curious about the source of money for funding the child savings accounts. And I have a lot of questions at once, but I'm interested.
These are good questions,
yeah.
right? I think Michael can talk more to the tax piece, because there's a lot of ways that we could think about taxes. But there are innovations in the field, and I don't know that these are necessarily the right innovations, right? I think we could think about it in many ways. And I think we have even examples here, like All Fun, we have foundations chipping in, we see cities taking parking fees. So there's many ways that people have creatively thought about how to finance these. We're doing some randomized control trials around rewards cards. So, you have on your keychain a rewards card, you go into any local grocery store and you get money, and you're able to take, every time you get a purchase, you get a rebate, and some of that money goes into the accounts. There's also, so that's on the individual level, more or less, the families doing that. On the county or state or city level, you have procurement cards. And in your charge, I don't want to get technical about this or take too long with this, but basically it's another way for the cities, every time they spend, to get a rebate that goes into a general fund that can help pay for these things. I'm not saying we have to do those things, but we need to be innovative in thinking about how we can get money into accounts, third parties, donations, a lot of things we can do to start to think about how to fund these in addition to federal funds and state funds.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. I just want to say, we're talking about reparations and others, and that our history of discrimination in the United States is being passed from generation to generation. So whites are 5 times more likely to get a large gift or inheritance, and what they do get is a lot more. And so some of the different proposals out, like Senator Booker has opportunity accounts proposal out, and that would give more, right now, a little difficulty measuring wealth, so more dependent on how much income a person has over their lives. But I think some different proposals around that might be about $80 billion. If you look at our mortgage interest tax deduction subsidy currently, I think it's about $170 billion. And that's subsidizing debt, right? Just that's the more debt you have on your house, the more money you get. So there's certainly more efficient use of those resources. And then other research, we've looked at the cost of financial insecurity to cities. So when a family has, half of Americans don't have $2,000 in emergency savings or non-retirement savings, so they're financially insecure. I think there's something like 14 times more likely to be evicted when an unexpected event happens. Homelessness costs cities a lot of money, more likely to have their utilities shut off, and you start adding up all these different costs, less likely to pay their housing, which means that they're not paying their property taxes. So we've gotten out city budgets. We've looked at where does the revenue come from and where do their costs come from, and have documented how much money it will save cities if their residents are financially secure. In terms of people who can pay property taxes, can pay consumption taxes, and aren't becoming homeless. So there's many different ways that I think they could be paid for.
I want to sneak one.
Please.
No, go ahead. You.
Well, if I just make the larger point here, we do, as you've heard, we do spend a lot of public money subsidizing asset accumulation. We have a public policy of creating inequality. You really have to understand it's structured. It's all the wealth, and even I'm a college professor, but all of my wealth is actually structured, and it's subsidized with the little wealth that I have. But it's not that I worked harder and deserved more. I got subsidized. So when we talk about you have to think about, well, what is government for? Government should be for creating a level playing field, enabling all people to do as well as possible. And that is not the public policy that we have. So I think it has to go back to these basic roots, because In a political discussion on Capitol Hill, it will be immediate, if you say, well, we want to change the mortgage interest tax deduction, everybody will immediately think, oh, you're dreaming. But I think we have to have that dream. I think we have to say, well, this is really bad policy. People don't have shelter, and we're moving, for some families, I don't know, $20,000 a year into their accounts. And it's really bad policy because we have to develop all the people. And I think we have to be on those principles, or else we can't win this argument. But the money is there. It's not like, where is it? We know where it is.
I must say, Michael, I hear it's not too late to get into the 2020 race, but if not, I hope you're writing some policy platforms for our candidates. Wally, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think Michael stated it beautifully. I wanted to mention one of the things the College Board has mentioned, potentially taking like federal, Pell Grants and putting them into accounts early on. So those are things we could think about as well. And why I think it's so important to the larger issue is that we're studying, like, does it affect expectations? But we don't really understand, just what it means to own an asset, to have an asset, and to grow up with an asset, and how that empowers people at the bargaining table. We've seen some incidents of this in the New York Times articles and stuff, right, recently with how people use their assets. And so it's just, it's even different. We should have an honest debate of whether it's better to finance college, just give them free college, or have people grow up with money. And I think there's real reasons and real benefit, even if you want to get to free, having them grow up with that money, then giving it to them on the back end. I think we should have an honest discussion about that and what would be better for kids and move them along more. But I'll stop there.
I think that's consistent with what we're seeing in our research, and that was one of our conclusions, is that Pell Grants, you're getting it at the very end, right? You don't know how much until you get there. Right. It's how much, by that age 18, that's I think why wealth was so much more powerful than income, is because it's there and you're growing up with that expectation and that ability.
And that empowerment.
Yeah.
Right, because how many people don't even get to college, right? There's so many people, and they're forced to decide, because I worked in social services a bit before school. And my clients, they had this $2,000 asset limit living in Montgomery County, and they're trapped. They can't move past their level, so it's not really a full success.
Yeah.
They're living better with a bit of a safety net. It's really not propelling them to where they want to be.
Yep, and we find that most caseworkers don't even know that asset limit is $2,000. They just know that you can't have any assets, so they're closing their accounts. They don't even have $500.
A lot of clients also believe you can't get benefits too. I know that.
So what's really important, even for a clinical practice student, is you have very deep policy knowledge of how that affects what you can and can't do for your clients, and really educate them well. Thank you so much. I'm going to take the next question. And panel, I want you to think about your last words after our colleague Tim McBride.
Thank you, Mary, and congratulations, Michael, and others for your great work on this over the years. I wanted to pick up on the policy ideas that others have mentioned, other than the development accounts, that might have bipartisan. All this should have bipartisan support, frankly. But Dr. McCurden, you mentioned the asset limits on programs. I don't know if you know this, but in Missouri, which I sometimes call the state of misery, we have not expanded Medicaid, but I chair the Medicaid Oversight Committee, but we've actually we've raised the asset limit on Medicaid in steps to $5,000.
Okay.
It used to be $2,000 in the state, which I totally agree with you is a total impediment towards the low-income people accumulating things like a car, for example. My wife did a study a few years ago, that people want people to go to work, but you have to have a car that's worth $1,999, which breaks down and then you get fired. So these are really important. So there's other public policies we can push, and the person who pushed for it in our state was the most conservative libertarian in our legislature.
Okay.
So I just sort of wanted, maybe you could talk about ideas that have resonance across the political spectrum.
That's great. Thanks. Opportunities at the local and state level, because we have talked a lot about the federal policy, but other opportunities that you see.
Well, I would just say two things about the Maine experience, although I don't think it's limited to us. So assets like savings in a 529 are actually excluded from the asset limit tests for public benefits in Maine, and so we're able to kind of carve that out. I think too that we're a little bit unusual in Maine in that we were funded by a private family foundation, so we don't have state money, we don't have we haven't worked with the legislature to pass bills or anything like that, but we do work in partnership with many kinds of organizations. And so I just want to make a super quick point about that. And some of those partners provide additional funding. So some of the, when we work in partnership with Head Starts in different locations around the state, other foundations have come in to put additional money into families' accounts if they open them, or open them for siblings and things like that. So we use those partnerships to expand the breadth and the depth of what we're doing, work with hospitals to make sure that all new families know about it. So there are monetary things that other partners can do, and there are also non-monetary things. We have over 30 leading Maine businesses, including LL Bean, for example, that makes payroll deduction for college savings available to their employees. And that's something they've done across the entire company, and a number of most of Maine's larger employers have done that as well. So there are things that are, even as we're thinking about how, to an earlier question, how you fund this, there's the seed money, but then there are other things and other ways that additional partners can contribute to the success and the reach and the efficacy of the program. So.
Beautiful, please.
Yeah, I'd love to add. I was just saying, thinking about the debt side of the balance sheets, a startling figure is that 1 in 3 Americans has debt and collections reported on their credit report. And that affects, your ability to rent an apartment, your ability to get a job, what you pay for insurance, never mind just your access to credit and what price you pay for it. And the most common form of debt and collections is medical debt and collections. So talking about what states can do, expanding Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion, people who have health insurance are much less likely to have medical debt and collections. And in fact, who's most likely to have it? Today's young, the millennials and Gen X are the most likely to have medical debt and collections. And who's least likely? It's the baby boomers and the silent generation. And that's because they have universal health care. Once you're age 65, right, they have medical care. So I think health insurance could be a policy as an employer. Does checking a credit report, does that really make a difference in a person's employment? We're at the municipal level, fees and fines, how are those assessed and who are they disproportionately affecting, and what is that doing to a credit record? So I think at the municipal, at the local, you could integrate asset building, state, but into your workforce development programs or others. So at all different levels, I think there are things that you can do.
Can I make one other quick point, if I could? There was a second part to the gentleman's question that also talked about, kind of how to reach across the political spectrum, and that's something we talk about within the field, is that, this kind of a gravitation towards one end of the political spectrum because things really feel like they resonate. But as I mentioned earlier, I just want to come back and put the point on this, that in Maine, a lot of the vision of our program is about workforce development. And really, Maine's economy, like that of many other states, is changing. It used to be fishing, farming, and forestry. And now it's, we need workers in healthcare and in IT. So the levels of education needed to sustain and grow the state's economy are changing over time. And we very much hope that our program is a part of that. And that's a message that resonates with everybody. And so I think that really being mindful of that as we think about how to talk about these policies will build a bigger coalition, I think, of folks to support these kinds of programs.
Right. So panelists, and you'll be the first to go, Michael. If there was one thing that you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say, no pressure. This is your 1 minute to say it down the line, and then our panelists will stay around afterwards. So, and Michael, because you're my colleague, you get 1.5 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you. I've probably talked enough today, but I just want to emphasize that, moving concepts into policy is like, it requires, you have to have a way to do it. And we've learned in this field that if you try to create a whole new policy, it's very difficult. But if you have a policy that you can take and use and make it do something different, that becomes much more politically feasible. And we're in that situation with children's accounts, and we should recognize that a 529 policy that has served only 4% of the population can, and this is not a dream, we've demonstrated this with a research study and in whole states. You can transform that policy to serve the whole population. This is maybe the most important policy point, that you can make a new policy that can do something entirely different.
Wonderful, thank you.
So say that wealth inequality is harming our nation. It's increasing. It's not inevitable. There are things that we can do about it as individuals, at the city level, at the county level, at the state level, and there's evidence on how to do it.
I'm a Brown alumnus, so I should get a minute 15.
A minute and 15, absolutely.
So this is kind of like a nerdy thing for people. I was talking to a student recently, and it came to me, and I think it's relevant here, is I think when we first started off, like in Michael's original book, there's a lot of talk about future orientation and whether low-income people have a future orientation. I want to submit to you, and I think Michael has already done this in his book, is that future orientation is something is a matter of the structure around you and how that allows you to think about the future and things. But I actually think, in the conversation I had with this student was low-income people actually have like short-term, mid-term, and long-term goals, but over a much in strategies, but over a much shorter time period, right? For someone like me who grew up like I did, 18 really didn't seem that realistic to me. Like, I didn't really understand that I would make it to 18, right? And it's hard for other people to think in those ways. When I went to WashU, I graduated in 3 years from the PhD program for those same reasons. It's still embedded in me in a way that I just felt like something would happen. I had to get through right away, right? So institution structures provide people with the freedom to think about their kids' futures and their futures. And that's the really important things about CSAs, is providing these people the opportunity to begin to think about their long-term futures.
Thank you.
So the official Maine state motto is Dorigo, which means I lead. And one of the favorite phrases we have in the Pine Tree State is, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. I think that'd be pretty cool.
Our incredibly smart, inspirational panelists have a lot more to say to you. And so they're willing to stay around, have some individual conversations, exchange cards. But I must say that I hope that Sharita, you mentioned all the students in the room. I hope all the students in the room are listening so carefully to what your trajectory can be to truly make a difference. And so, and all of you are truly my inspiration. So thank our panelists again. Thank you to all the organizers at the Center for Social Development, our partners at CRISP, Clark Fox Policy Institute, and so many others that made today possible. Please come up and have some individual conversations with each other. And Charles, come on up. You probably have a few announcements.
I just want to thank Dr. McKay and all the panelists for a stimulating conversation. And it's just so much food for thought. I have questions of my own, but I'll catch Michael and ask him. But one reason we're doing this is we're filming this, we're taping this, so this will be available to schools if you want to show it to your classes and have these conversations on your campuses. And hopefully next time we gather here next year, we'll be able to tell you how many co-sponsors we have on our bill.